As I've been saying about all the Chinese EVs is that they do not make a profit, at least any BEV side of the business, and eventually they can only continue making losses for so long until they run out of money. I've been saying this the whole time, that they need to ramp up to volume production to achieve economies of scale before they run out of money, and even attempting that can crucify a business, just like it nearly did to Tesla, back with production hell. But it doesn't take a genius to work out that there is another alternative that the Chinese EVs can do that will also make them a profit. They can simply raise their prices. Why haven't they already, you might ask? Yes, it's strange. The only thing I can assume is that they simply do not have enough demand yet. This might be due to lack of infrastructure or established showrooms and service centres in other cities in countries outside of China. Countries that might very well be willing to pay higher prices for their cars due to the waits on Teslas being so long, except the waits on Teslas are not really that long yet. So what about when the waits on Teslas really do start to get crazy, with possibly waiting lists of a year or two? Then the Chinese can raise their prices, as clearly demand for EVs has increased. People will eventually work out that EVs cost a lot less to run than ICE vehicles, and if gas prices keep climbing to crazy levels, then it simply makes the EVs more affordable, except that if they are costing around $60,000, then that is probably too much for the typical person, especially those that are suffering at the gas pumps, which is about the price XPeng or BYD need to be charging to make some net profits if they can't achieve volume production. But the consumer that can afford $60,000 for an EV probably could also afford the expense of gas in the ICE car too. Yes, there could be demand for vehicles like the compact BYD Dolphin perhaps, but consumers may decide that a plug-in hybrid is a more suitable solution and that they'll just charge them continually, and chargers will become more ubiquitous within time. I mean, we say that people need at least 250 miles of range and more like 300 miles in the US perhaps, but charging will become faster and eventually there'll be chargers everywhere. You go to the mall, you charge. You go to a restaurant, you charge. You go to work, you charge. So even with a plug-in hybrid, perhaps they may be able to get 50 miles of range. I mean, that might mean minimal fuel required and likely enough for your day-to-day driving, but still gives the driver the confidence that if they do need to go further, then they can, and equally don't need to be worried about range anxiety. I know we think of plug-in hybrids as the worst of both worlds, but it might even be the necessary substitute in the meantime whilst the world generates enough batteries and ramps up BEV production. We're still not close to enough batteries. Even Tesla will only be making about 20 million cars by the end of this decade, and I think their market share will be a lot higher than people think. If gas prices do increase, then that will give people much more incentive to continually charge their hybrids. This should still reduce emissions dramatically. I know it's not the all-electric future we want, but there aren't enough electric cars to go around. There may not be enough plug-in hybrids either. In fact, I think Tesla's market share today is a lot higher than people think, especially when you factor in the relative number of batteries that Tesla control, compared to the actual number of cars they make. You can make 10 times as many cars if the cars use 1/10 the batteries. I think the market share has been distorted, and I think the success of Chinese EVs has been hidden with statistics. There is no way better to lie than using statistics, and 69% of people know this. Now, the real factor that no one seems to point out, which actually is the antithesis of what I have been saying, yes, I can probably argue against my reasons better than a lot of other people too. The argument against my points, which I also haven't heard anyone use to back up the success China might see in their EVs, is CATL. CATL have some absolutely insane production targets for their batteries, or at least we have heard, but nothing official. For example, we've heard that CATL aim to hit 540 gigawatt hours by 2023. If this is true, then that's a lot of batteries for a lot of cars. Perhaps almost 10 million cars that have a range of almost 200 miles maybe, and they have been investing billions into new plants. Although we do hear other reports that this may not be achieved until more like 2025, which it does sound more likely. This also sounds like it will be an improved chemistry and more energy dense, likely lower cost, which is a big deal for the Chinese EVs, and something that BYD have already achieved. And sure, BYD have their own battery production, but it's pale in comparison to CATL's. I think those other targets are grossly optimistic. 600 gigawatt hours sounds much more likely by 2025, especially given the amount they're investing. Car manufacturing cannot grow faster than battery production, except for making smaller batteries in the cars, which again are not suitable for export. But that's fine. If the Chinese consumers replace their ICE car with Chinese EVs that have small batteries and minimal range, then that's still good for the transition of fossil fuels. But don't forget, CATL's largest customer is Tesla, and Tesla also want these batteries for energy storage. But either way, let's say if CATL actually have enough batteries to sell to Chinese EVs to supply 5 million vehicles that do have ranges of over 200 miles by 2025, In other words, EVs that are likely suitable for overseas markets, and maybe even possibly closer to 250 miles of range by this stage with improved chemistry and EV efficiencies, then perhaps 1 million might be exported, of which still only a small percentage would end up in the US. But I struggle to get my head around how 1 million Chinese EVs could feasibly operate in the US. It's a huge country, and this might be split into 5 different Chinese manufacturers, i.e. 200,000 a year each. That makes economies of scale really tough, especially when you get into the likes of service centres. I read all your comments and all I ever hear is things like, but Sandy Munro said this. No one is ever prepared to tell me how the Chinese will enter the US, with what strategy. Don't just believe one person, not Sandy, not me, not even Elon sometimes, and certainly not CNBC. Try and research things for yourself and come to your own conclusion. This is what I've been doing with Tesla this whole time, and thus trusted my opinion, which gave me the conviction to buy big on an investment that is now up 20 times. It's great to listen to lots of perspectives, but then they should only encourage you to look for yourself. Check out the same data they're using and see if you can draw the same conclusions. And look at more relevant data too that they may have missed. Also, a lot of people have narratives or agendas they're trying to fill, like CNBC likely protecting their customers who advertise with them, namely Ford or GM. And some people don't want to be wrong and will try and support their decision where they can. I'm not doing this. I'm trying to give objective journalism, real, true journalism, and I'm proud of it, even though it may not be the most popular view. I know what kind of things I could talk about to make this channel more popular. It's easy, but I simply don't. I'm not doing this to make money. My agenda is to work out how this industry will play out and predict what will become of Tesla the best. My reward is acknowledgement of getting it right. Anyway, clearly, at this rate, I think 1 million Chinese EVs a year in the US will be extremely unlikely. China may be increasing production at amazing rates, but if the batteries are not going at the same rate, then it's totally moot. Except for the fact that they are making cars with smaller batteries, which is also moot, as the rest of the world doesn't want slow, dangerous, underpowered cars with impractical range. From the Chinese offering, the overseas consumers want the likes of XPeng, NIO and BYD, yet these companies so far have failed to make profits or hit volume production, which is what Elon keeps telling us is near impossible. Bear in mind then that Tesla still has a huge head start, even over the Chinese EVs, and if it's not going to be until 2025 until the Chinese can finally deliver a reasonable quantity, if things went well for them, then at most it would still only be about 2 to 5% of the overall US auto market share. Well, there is a high possibility that Tesla has their compact by that stage, and possibly even a robotaxi network too. Do you think XPeng can compete with a $25,000 Tesla that has maybe 300 miles of range, selling their 200 or maybe 250 mile range car for over twice the price when you factor in tariffs and rebates? If you think the Chinese are going to win, then you have to be able to have an answer for all these questions. As far as I can tell, all of the people who say China will dominate have just put 2 factors together. One being China is ramping up at such a rate, and it will continue, despite these figures being somewhat distorted, and they will totally dominate because they can make so many cars, and their cars are so much better than legacy autos EVs that they will eat that market, like the XPeng P7. Except the majority of these cars that are in these large quantities are not suitable for overseas markets. And the second factor simply being that history repeats, so that what happened in the US with the Japanese autos will simply happen again. They're adding these 2 factors and saying Chinese will dominate the US. I have now given so many arguments to the contrary that no one has yet to address at all, despite me addressing head-on all the other arguments. And don't forget that my original narrative was the same as everyone else's until I got deep into research that perhaps people don't want to look at, and judging from some of the comments, may be suffering from cognitive dissonance, or perhaps have invested in XPeng or BYD. Remember, I know everyone else says it too, but Tesla is the next Tesla. In fact, Tesla is the only Tesla. There's no new Google on the way either, just like there's no new Tesla on the way. There is another option you might think, rather than ramping up existing models, then simply adding more models and more production lines. Well, this will most likely result in more losses. They need to reduce costs through economies of scale or lower production costs, or they need to increase prices to increase gross margin, which might eventually cover OPEX. So to conclude, and I really think this is where I end it now, Chinese EVs unlikely to reach volume production without going bankrupt. To seek profitability, they will need to reduce costs in other areas, namely batteries, which the technology is headed in the right direction for them. Then demand increases for EVs enough that the Chinese can raise their prices to also make a profit, most likely in overseas markets, but they may have issues with protectionism on top of that. The majority of EVs will serve the Chinese markets as they are much lower cost and not suitable or legal for exporting to other markets. Again, with technology improvements, they could eventually make a profit with costs reducing. China is such a large market to serve, by the time they have production levels up high enough to enter the US and costs down low enough to compete in the US, because Tesla's waiting lists are so long and legacy orders haven't ramped up fast enough, then the market will be more saturated. And even then, China couldn't export that many to the US. If gas prices have risen so much that everyone needs electric cars, then the Chinese EVs will also be expensive, which will make robotaxis that much more affordable. The US will also have the alternative option of highly subsidized PHEVs also. I never said Chinese EVs will not succeed, I just don't support the narrative that they will dominate the US. I think it seems highly unlikely. As for their success, just like legacy autos, the Chinese still have a hard time ahead too, and a lot needs to happen until they make net profits. And they don't have unlimited funds. There are hundreds of Chinese EV companies, just like around the start of the 19th century, there were hundreds of internal combustion companies. Well, if we're thinking history will repeat, then surely these will also consolidate too. You can't have it both ways. Anyway, that's where I am on the subject, but I am more than happy to openly talk it through anyone who is happy enough to discuss it through pragmatically. Either way, I think we can all agree that it's going to be harder for the Chinese in the US than most people originally thought. Thanks for listening. Please hit the thumbs up and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter and talk to me on Patreon.